Well, Iowa's essentially playing a less talented clone of themselves, really. When you look at it, when
That's
they beat
a good analogy.
Penn State, they beat Michigan. These were spread offenses. Now you have Wisconsin, which is much more in the, 3 yards in a cloud of dust mindset. It'll be interesting to see if they can maintain their defensive momentum of stopping some big offenses.
Scott?
Well, and it was interesting because Iowa's big sort of sticking point going into the Michigan game was their ability to stop the run. And Brandon Miner had a fantastic game against them on Saturday. Wisconsin's running back, John Clay, is very good, and he is a big boy, and he can run through people. So it'll be interesting to see that battle. Iowa's defensive line and their front seven playing against John Clay running the ball for Wisconsin. So that could be a key matchup. I could see if John Clay really has a great game, Wisconsin winning that football game.
And of course, at Camp Randall, an intimidating place for sure, a tough place to play. And I think just because of that, you have to give Wisconsin a slight edge in this game anyhow. It would be, despite Iowa being the number 11, 12, whatever team in the country.
And going into Happy Valley, which is one of the much more intimidating places in the
than
nation.
Camp Randall, yeah, indeed. We'll have to see. If you had to handicap it right now, guys, and it's not a fair question, who's going to the Rose Bowl in the Big Ten this year? At this point in the season, chance to make yourself look stupid. Come on,
I'll put you on the spot.
Oh gosh, I think it's going to come down to Ohio State and Iowa, and we were just talking off the air about this. None of these teams are really great, so Ohio State keeps finding ways to win. So I think Ohio State's going to the Rose Bowl.
Interesting pick. I mean, you look at Ohio State's schedule, finishing the season at Penn State, home against Iowa, at Michigan. That's a really tough finish. And you look at those games against Penn State and Iowa, I mean, those two games will really determine who gets to the Rose Bowl. It's a tough decision. Maybe Iowa, but I don't want to put too much weight onto that. So
yeah, I think we're selling Penn State short here.
Yeah.
Because Penn State, they do have to come to the big house. We'll talk about what we think is going to happen in that game a little bit later in the show as we handicap the rest of the season. But they avoid Wisconsin. Right. Which is big. So Penn State, they've got their loss out of the way, and they get Ohio State at home. So we'll have to see. No one really knows, obviously. Well, let's take a look at the national scene now. Of course, the Michigan-Iowa game was probably the second best game of the week, even going into it. But the best game was Florida-LSU, and Florida came out on top 13-3. Tim Tebow, struggling through his concussion and lack of mental awareness, and pulled the Gators to a 13-3 victory. So you take a look at the AP Top 25, Florida, Alabama, 1-2 there. Alabama jumps Texas for that number 2 spot. And, thus ensues, Alabama, of course, beat Ole Miss, which is, an extremely overranked team that has continually lost any important game. And then you take a look, Notre Dame sneaking in the top 25 as well. So let's talk about this Florida team, guys. Is Florida the team to beat in Division I, in FBS, whatever the heck they call it now?
No question about it. I mean, and all this talk about Tebow really takes away the focus that their defense is absolutely terrifying. They are stacked on every level.
Oh, this is a terrifying hit right here.
Yeah, so their defense is absolutely absurd. I cannot understate that anymore. And all this talk about Tebow really takes away the fact just how shut down of a team they are.
Yeah, well, let's not forget the vaunted Oklahoma offense last year against the Florida defense, who returns most of their players, as I recall. So Florida has a very good defense, and I mean, come on, they're by far the best team in the country. When they can beat LSU so convincing, well, one might argue it wasn't a beatdown, obviously it wasn't, but they beat them with a weakened Tim Tebow. They're by far the best team in the country, I would say.
So that brings up the question, of course, 2 teams it takes to play a national championship game. Who is the number 2 team? We have to look. This next week might give us to shed some light on this question. We'll start with the biggest game this weekend, despite what ESPN probably wants you to think. Oklahoma and Texas. Now, Oklahoma got Sam Bradford back last week. They won 33-7 against Baylor. Baylor's not a very good team, but still, Sam Bradford proved that he could put up some points. But he's not going to be playing against Baylor next week. He's going to be playing against a tough Texas defense like you see right there. If Texas wins, they will jump Alabama for that number 2 slot. And of course, there's a lot that still has to unfold. But you can foresee a scenario where an undefeated Alabama and Florida meet in the SEC championship game. One beats the other, and like 2006, the loser of the SEC championship game goes to the national championship game again. Or the loser of the SEC championship plays in the national championship game despite losing in that last week. That's assuming, of course, that Texas takes out Oklahoma. Do you think this is going to happen, Scott?
Texas has looked mortal the past couple weeks, and obviously Oklahoma has also looked mortal, despite the fact that they were missing Sam Bradford while this was all going on. I think Oklahoma is going to win this game. I really do. With Sam Bradford back, he looked good, given it was only against Baylor last weekend. So, and Texas struggled against Colorado before finally opening up in the second half. I think Oklahoma is going to win this game.
Really?
I do.
That's an interesting. I'm not
really
questioning it. That's an interesting perspective.
I disagree. I think Texas has a huge revenge factor here. Don't forget, because they beat Oklahoma last year and ended up being shut out in the Big 12 championship game and the national championship game. I think they have a huge emotional edge here. I think they're going to come out firing and they'll defeat Oklahoma.
Yeah, there is something to be said for Oklahoma's case, though. Oklahoma lost to two very good teams so far, BYU when Bradford got hurt, and then Miami, who's been just
prolific.
They played a crazy schedule. And then quickly, guys, USC at Notre Dame this weekend as well. Have to pay attention to it because it's Notre Dame, and of course it's USC as well. Do you think that the Fighting Irish can pull off an upset here, Scott? Do you think they've grown the grass high enough?
Well, they don't need to grow the grass quite as high because Reggie Bush is, and obviously referring a couple years ago when Notre Dame allegedly didn't cut the grass for 2 weeks in order to slow Reggie Bush down. But I think Notre Dame could very well win this game. USC has not looked fantastic this year, even besides the Washington game. The Ohio State game they played was a very sloppy football game in a lot of ways. I think Notre Dame has a good chance to pull this off, but I still think USC's better. Key matchup, freshman Matt Barkley playing against Jimmy Clausen. I think whoever gets the better of that matchup is on the winning team on Saturday.
Well, Jimmy Clausen's a Heisman candidate and Matt Barkley is not, so we know who's going to come up on top on that one.
Well, I'd have to agree with Scott. I think USC has the upper hand here, but Notre Dame does have a chance to win. They have a really underrated offense when you look at it, even with Michael Floyd being out for the rest of the season.
Well, it's an unfortunate position to be in, Michigan fans, but certainly Michigan rooting for Notre Dame to do well this weekend. It's a tough thing to do. Well, we have to go to the commercial break. That's tough as well. But when we come back, we're going to take a look at how Michigan will fare the rest of the season. Welcome back to Varsity Blue. Alex Prasad, Scott Wagner, Peter Saul, running out of time. Let's take a look at the rest of the schedule, guys. Of course, Michigan playing Delaware State this weekend. There's a presumed outcome of that game. We won't mention what that is, not to jinx it. But okay, this is what the schedule looks like the rest of the way. Delaware State, Penn State at home, at Illinois, Purdue, at Wisconsin, Ohio State. Now in a second here, we're going to see our picks. But given these last two losses, apparently Peter and Scott have a very different feeling about how the season's going to shape up.